Well, now, look, we've spoken about this before, and quite frankly, it can't be spoken about often enough. With some of the American heavyweights in town last night, you would have seen the excellent interview that Peter did with the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. In that interview, amongst other things, he urged Australia to stand up for itself over trade with China. I should say I made that point yesterday on my radio program. The reality is a Lowy Institute poll recently found only 32% of Australians trust China to act responsibly in the world. That's down from 52% last year. 70% say we should try to prevent Beijing's growing influence in the Pacific. 75% said we were too economically dependent on China. As you know, China is the main destination for our resource exports, and of course they own in Australia almost everything. Water, dairy farms, beef farms, avocado farms, our paddock to their plate. 1/3 of the $35 billion in our education export income is from China. And they're increasingly aggressive in the South China Sea. There is talk as well of cyber security infiltration in Australia, including the ANU's IT network. There have been revelations about, and I quote, sophisticated state actors using cyber means to attack our parliament, as well as Liberal, Labor and National Party headquarters. As I've said many times, we are a better place for the contribution in every field in this country by people of Chinese heritage. The point being made by Mike Pompeo and Peter last night is that Beijing has to be asked to respect our wish to protect our interests by prohibiting outside manipulation of our system of government. One thing that's mystified all Australians is our Chinese outfit, Land Bridge, was given a 99-year lease of the Port of Darwin. And this outfit has close ties to the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army. This was in 2015. 4 years on, the strategic challenges facing us and America are more serious than they were then. One US official has described China as wielding a, quote, toolkit of coercion. It prompts a simple question. Who gave away the Port of Darwin? And why wasn't America consulted? And if we've given it away, well, out of the infrastructure budget, we'd better build a Darwin port for ourselves. We face major strategic issues, none more important than the question of oil. Now, we've raised this point many times before with the one person who knows what he's talking about here, and this is Senator Jim Molan. Senator Molan, AODSC, is a retired Major General who ran the war in Iraq in 2004-2005, part of which involved the protection of Iraq's oil production exported out of the North Arabian Gulf. He argued fewer than 2 months ago that at most we have only 23 days of liquid fuel in reserve, and we're therefore dangerously exposed to tensions in the Middle East and the Pacific. This has now led to reports this week that the Morrison government is negotiating with the Trump administration to buy millions of barrels of oil from America's tightly guarded fuel reserves under an emergency strategy to lower the risk of Australia plunging into an economic and national security crisis. Thankfully, someone's woken up in Canberra to the warnings of Senator Molan, Andrew Hastie and others that we've got to shore up dangerously low domestic storage levels, which have left Australia vulnerable to price hikes and rationing in the event of war or disaster in the oil-rich Middle East or the increasingly volatile South China Sea. This is the guts of it. We import 90% of our liquid fuels. We have only enough petrol and crude oil to last 28 days. We're obliged under an agreement with the International Energy Agency to have 90 days of reserves. Now we learn the Morrison government has locked in, quote, constructive discussions with America for the right to tap into its enormous strategic petroleum reserves. So let's go to Senator Jim Molan in Canberra. Jim, good evening to you. How important is this latest development?
Alan and Peter, good evening. It is very, very important, Alan, very important indeed. But to understand it, I think you've got to understand what problem the Minister Taylor is trying to solve. And I totally support what he's doing. And the problem that he's trying to solve in the first instance is a problem where Australia's fuel is not cut off entirely. That's a different scenario altogether. This is a problem where it's significantly reduced. For example, if something bad happens in the Gulf and a significant proportion, 20 or 30 or 40% of our crude or our product is lessened, then the way to solve that is by having any number of different sources that we can go to. So adding the Americans, a major source, and they don't need this as much nowadays because of their self-reliance through gas. Then the more diverse are our sources of supply, the more stable we are. A lot of people are confused, Ellen, because they think that what the minister is trying to solve is if we were cut off entirely, and that's possible, a very small probability, but enormous consequences. This is for an intermediate situation.
It is important, I think, for the benefit of our viewers to note that this Strategic Petroleum Reserve was established by President Gerald Ford in 1975 to keep America running in a crisis, pardon me. And, Jim, as I understand it, the oil is stored in massive caverns in Texas and Louisiana, and there are 640 million barrels of crude oil, and they've only been accessed 19 times. So it's a rather good position to be in with the alliance, isn't it?
It's a fabulous position to be in, but we don't want to assume that it solves every problem we're going to face. This solves what is the most pressing problem, and I think that's the really smart thing that Minister Taylor has done in accessing this. The reason that it doesn't solve everything is that it is crude. It's not petrol that we can put in the car or diesel we can put in the truck. This is crude. It'll take 20 days to get to this country. We've got to find a shipping organisation that would move it in an emergency. And if it's not a worldwide emergency, you can do that. But if it's for example, if there's a clash between America and Chinese forces in the South China Sea, the lack of insurance capability may mean that if people aren't going to insure hulls and they're not going to insure cargoes, nothing moves. So this is great. It's great for one of the intermediate scenarios, and we shouldn't misinterpret it as being the answer to all our prayers.
Yeah, Jim, I'm just going to pick you up on that point because I think we need to underscore it. This is sort of a, in case of emergency, break glass sort of option for Australia. And yeah, good on the government, but it doesn't solve the broader problem. We've got issues with our refining capacity in Australia, which has diminished over time. You're right, you're talking about crude. That can't be utilised immediately. But of course, if you look at geography, look where we are in the world. If the crisis or the fight is in the Middle East, and then we're relying on this American product to get to our shores, if there was also a skirmish in and around the South China Sea, or there are issues with the passage of ships, we are caught at both ends, aren't we, geographically? And that's the problem we've got to grapple with, in particular, losing our refining capacity here in Australia.
Yes, and we have 4 refineries left in Australia. They're all working at about 90% productivity, and one of them has closed down temporarily in Brisbane for maintenance. So even if we could pour more crude into them, Peter, we can't increase the output. When they're all working to 90%, they provide about 40% of the total use of product that we use in this country. Yeah, it's easier to get the fuel. See, we're confusing 2 things here. We're confusing the International Energy Agency requirement for 90 days, and we're holding some of that fuel in the Netherlands.
Can I just pick you up on that international...
A more immediate thing.
Can I, Jim, pick you up on that International Energy Agency requirement? My understanding is that Minister Taylor and the government are arguing that that should be renegotiated and that the 90-day requirement should incorporate Australia's capacity to include crude and refined product which is on its way to Australia. Now, as you've made many times, there are 45 tankers at any given time on the way to Australia. Should that quantity of available product be incorporated into what is available to Australia, in which case we would meet our International Energy Agency 90-day requirement?
That's absolutely correct, Ellen. And that applies to something which is short of a military emergency, short of a wartime situation. And so I have absolutely no worries about that. The European nations are allowed to count their fuel which is travelling by barge or by ship through their internal waterways, and we should be able to count it coming towards us. But as I say, that does not solve the more extreme scenarios, which we don't need to spend money on them now. We just need to understand what we may have to do in the future.
Yes. Nonetheless, there are 90 tankers. I mean, we don't want to alarm Australians, do we? The first, on the one hand, we are totally dependent. Here, with the lights on, going to work tomorrow, putting fuel in our car, we're totally dependent on an imported product. But nonetheless, against that, there are 90 tankers at any given time in Australian ports in every month.
That's correct. There are 45 coming to us. They come from the Middle East. They come from any number of countries. But as Peter spoke to the Secretary of State about, the issue that we're talking about here is not just the Middle East, it's about China. And the probability of things going wrong in our region, to put it nicely, our strategic environment is deteriorating. But that's the probability of things going wrong. It's still small in our region, but it is increasing. And although it's a small risk, Alan, I'd say the consequences of that going wrong are enormous. Now is the time to plan and prepare.
Jim, what I found fascinating in my discussion with the Secretary was, in response to 60-odd nations that are now talking about an international coalition to secure the transit routes in and around the Strait of Hormuz, he made the point that Australia has a request on its desk to be a part of the coalition. Maurice Payne says Australia is seriously considering this request. But he underscored the point because, you see, the US now are energy self-sufficient, basically, out of their shale gas and other things. They are not as reliant on the Middle East as they perhaps were in the past. And he is saying, basically, you guys have got to get involved because you've actually got more of a stake in this area than we have in energy terms. And don't sit on your hands. We're not going to be the policeman of the world unless the world starts to pull its weight. Now, why aren't Australians, the government, already organising our affairs to be there and be involved?
Well, I think it was good that they brought it back to the National Security Council to begin with. But President Trump himself, before he became president, was quoted as saying that the world laughs at us. We escort tankers through the Gulf that we don't own, carrying fuel that we don't need for allies who don't defend themselves. Now, that's his attitude.
Absolutely.
Absolute attitude.
It's not wrong.
And it's in our interest to do it.
He's saying to people, listen, we're not going to be the policeman of the world. Jim, just before we go, answer a simple question, if you would. Why do we export most of our local crude?
The reason that we do is most of it goes as condensate out of the northwest. So it's the waste product of the gas production, and it's pretty well just sent up north to be processed up there.
And second question before we go: who in 2015, in a Conservative government, gave a 99-year lease to an outfit inextricably bound up with the Communist Party of China, a 99-year lease to the Port of Darwin? Who the hell approved that?
We all did, sadly, Alan, and we won't do it again. And I'd have to say, if we want the Port of Darwin back, we could get it tomorrow with a policeman and a dash of resolution.
Good on you. All right, Jim, good to talk to you, and thank you for your time.
Thanks,
There
Alan.
he is,
Thanks,
Senator
Peter.
Jim Molan.
Just on that point, it was Adam Giles's government in the Turnbull era who did that. And it went out to a tender in the period of July and October. Abbott went in September, July and October. In October, the deal was done with a Chinese Communist Party-linked organisation.
Well, we need a port of our own up there, I think.